Hello, this is Dr. Mahmoud. We're going to start with chapter 11 of operations planning and control. And in this chapter, what we're going to talk about is aggregate planning and master scheduling. Before we start this chapter, I want to just remind you, let's go back to a few chapters when we talked about the company's mission, vision, goals, strategies, and then actions with which we use the KPIs. And now we're going to continue. We're going to dig deep into that strategic planning and send that plan that we created starting from the mission and vision. And then we created the goals, and then we created the strategies, and then the action plan. And now what we're going to do, we're going to talk about implementing the plan. So all what we did, it was just preparing to this moment, which we created the goals, and now it's time to implement these using some of these strategic plan and actions. So let's take a look into what is aggregate planning. Aggregate planning, it's a bigger picture approach where you need to look into the overall demand, not only for specific individual products. For example, if you are a company where selling TVs, you don't want to look into how many units you sell for 40-inch TVs versus the 46 or 55. What you want to do is take a look into the overall demand for all the TVs, and then you start planning for this demand to meet the customer needs. And this way, you could understand the overall demand and the overcapacity that you need. So you could do some plan for employment, output levels, and these important decisions that we should make in order to meet the demand. So the goal for aggregate planning is to achieve a production plan that will effectively utilize the organization resources to satisfy the demand. So again, we're looking into the bigger picture, not only specific products or individual products. We need to look into the overall demand so we could know on how many people we have to hire, how much would cost us, etc. So let's take a look into this graph here where you see when we start with anything, we start with a business plan, and we take a look into the payback period, ROI, feasibility study, and all these kind of things. And then we go down to implement that using the aggregate plan. And the aggregate plan will establish the operations capacity. We'll say, okay, in order to meet this demand, we need XYZ employees. And then we move on down. So instead of talking about the whole aggregate plan, we're going to talk about the master schedule where we talk about each individual product. So one of the things that we see in operations management, it's sometimes hard to predict the demand, and we have to deal with variation. Variation basically where you need to accommodate that variation. Sometimes you have a high demand, sometimes low demand. It all depends on the market and many other factors. So what we need to do is to consider some strategies to deal with the demand, such as what we call it cushion capacity. Last chapter we did talk about capacity and how we could have some cushion capacity to absorb that demand. Also, what we could do, you could hire temporary workers, or you could maybe offer overtime to meet the demand. So these are the things that we use to meet the demand and manage the variation in the demand. And this also will help you to meet uncertain level of supply. Whenever you have an unpredicted supply or demand, you could meet them through these strategies. Another chart that will help you to understand. So you start with the forecasting of aggregate demand, then develop the general plan, and then update the aggregate plan based on a monthly basis. So let's take a look into the input and the output for aggregate plan. So what do we need to create that plan? We need to look into the resources, including the workforce, the production rates, facilities and equipment, the demand forecast. We look to the policies as well. And of course, it's important to look into the inventory cost, the back orders, hiring, overtime, inventory changes, and subcontracting. Now, the output, once we're done, we created the aggregate plan. This is the output. We'll have an idea on what would be the cost for that plan. And we will take a look into some projected level of inventory, output, deployment, subcontracting, and back ordering. So we will have an idea on if we need to save some inventory, we'll have excess inventory that we have to consider. We will take a look into the number of units that we will be able to produce, and employment, that would be also how many workers you need, subcontractors, if you need to meet the demand, you probably want to use some subcontractors. These are the things that we should consider, and back ordering as well. Some of the things that we need to consider, we did talk about in the previous slides, but here's again, we could deal with variation and supplies based on hire or layoff workers. Depends if we have a high demand season, a busy season, we could hire more temporary workers. If we don't have that season, we could lay off that worker. And if sometimes we need to do some overtime or maybe hire part-time workers, we should maybe keep some safety stocks in the inventory, and then subcontracting as well in order to do the meet the demand. So here are two strategies that we use to meet the demand. One is called the level capacity strategy, and the other one is the chase demand strategy. The first one will maintain a steady rate of output. So for example, we say based on the number of workers that we have, based on the machines that we have, we can make 1,000 units every month. So that's a level capacity strategy where you keep it constant, you keep it at the same level. And the other strategy, which is called the chase demand strategy. From the name of this strategy, we chase the demand and we match the capacity to demand. The planned output for the period is set the expected demand for that period. More details on the chase capacity or the chase approach, which is the capacity, are adjusted to match the demand. So we have a demand of 1,000 units, so we have to match that capacity. We could hire more people, rent new machines, or do some subcontracting. These are the things that there are advantages for it. Investment in inventory is low, so they're based on the chase approach. We don't have to plan for inventory. So we exactly match the demand. Labor utilization is high. You have to really utilize your labor. And some of the disadvantages, which is the cost for adjusting the output. Sometimes it's very risky where you have to hire people, fire people, and buy a new machine, rent a new machine. So there are some cost adjusting to meet that level. And for the level approach, this is where we keep the capacity constant. We say, okay, this is what we could do, 1,000 units. We're not going to meet the demand. We know that, but maybe hopefully we could, if we have inventory, we could send them to the customer. Sometimes we have the back orders. We need to deal with that separately. So some of the advantage is the stable output. Disadvantages would be building inventory, and we have to pay for cost for that inventory. Increased overtime in idle time. So sometimes you have to pay for overtime, and sometimes we don't have that capacity. So especially, you have to deal with that. Resource utilization vary over the time. So not sure how the utilization for your resources. It depends on your level of capacity. All right, so here's some few steps that we could use to plan for the aggregate planning. Again, we're looking into the bigger picture. We're not going to focus on to specific product. We're going to take a look into the overall demand. So first of all, you need to determine the demand for each period, determine the capacity, and then identify some policies in the company that you should consider. Number 5, you need to develop alternative plans and costs. What are different alternatives that do I have? And then select the plan that best fits your need. One of the techniques that we use here, it's called the trial and error techniques. The trial and error techniques, it's a simple and easy way to use some tables and graphs to help you visualize the projected demand. And we could do some alternatives, comparing alternatives together to find out what would be the cost. But there's some advantages to that. Even it's simple, easy, this is the most common used. However, the only one advantage for it is it does not necessarily result on an optimal aggregate plan. So sometimes we don't have that really accurate planning for it. So that's one of the things sometimes it's not good. So let's get into the trial and error techniques, we will have a table like this. We will have the forecast. Here's where you're forecasting the demand over these periods. You will calculate the output. It depends on what techniques you're using. Are you using the chase, or you're using the level capacity, which is the constant output? You have to look into some of the regular time, how many workers needs to be to work as a regular time, full time, if you want to pay for overtime, subcontractors. And here on this column right here, we could look into the output minus the forecast, and that will help you to find out the back orders and inventories. Inventory, we have three factors: beginning inventory, ending inventory, and average inventory. And the backlog based on what the demand is. And here, this section, we'll talk about the cost, how much you pay for output, overtime, subcontract, and inventory, and the cost for back orders as well. Sometimes we use the chart to demonstrate that period. We could create that. So what I'm going to do is we're going to share with you an example here in just a second using Excel of this example is in the textbook, so you may take a look into that. But before we do that, there are other techniques before we do the trial and error, which is basically trying different parameters and select the best strategy for us. There's different techniques where you take a look into the linear programming, simulation, and these kind of things. But however, what we're going to do is going to use spreadsheet based on the trial and error techniques, and this is what going to be focus for this chapter. All right, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to end the video right here, and I will start sharing with you my Excel sheet for that example. I'll see you in another video.